Hello and welcome to EE 447. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. In this video, we are going to continue with the theme of HTML tables, specifically style HTML tables. We're going to use this time around, though, instead of having our cascading style sheets or CSS in line with the HTML elements, we're going to figure out how to group them and place them at the top of our HTML document. So to begin with, what I've done is I've actually leveraged our example table 03 and I've stripped out all of the style information. So we are back to our rather boring, if not rather ugly, HTML page. And I have kept the contents of the nested table within the fourth column of the table. So to begin with, what I'd like to do is I'd like to recreate what we did in table 3. So I'd probably suggest that you keep table 3 open so that you can bounce back and forth to sort of see the variations, or excuse me, see the similarities between the two approaches and see how this second approach is perhaps more efficient. And so if you remember from last time, every column of every row had to have the style information included. It's not terribly efficient, and also it means that if you want to make a change in one place, you have to very carefully make that change in many locations. So there has to be a better way, or at least an alternate way, that will allow for us to essentially factor out the style information. And it happens there is. So there's several ways that you can style your elements. The first way is by simply using the tag name. So to begin with, we're going to insert directly after, or rather in the HTML tag, within the HTML tag, after the head, excuse me, rather within the head, after the opening of the head tag, but within the head tag is where you would include the style information. So you start off with a style tag, and then within the style tag, you specify the name or the element name that you wish to apply the styles to. And so to begin with, we want to start off applying the styles to the table. And for that particular element, we start off by using a pair of curly braces, and within those curly braces goes the CSS or the style information that we would have otherwise put in line in the table element or the table tag. And so if you recall from last time, a couple of the properties that we changed in the style sheet was we added a ridge style border, we did border collapse, and we specified the background color for the table to be green. Now, once again, you can choose the aesthetics for this particular example, or you can follow along with mine. But for the table, what we want to do first is we want to specify the border just like we did before. And I'm going to just stick with ridge because I find that reasonably attractive. And then for the border collapse, we still want to specify the collapse property. And note how after each one of these, I am following it up with a semicolon, just like we did with the inline. And then lastly, then the background color of green. Now, this will then give us the style information for our table, and it will apply it, more importantly, to any table element. So keep that in mind, that remember that we actually have a total of 4 tables here, the large table and then the 3 nested tables that reside in our 4th column. Now keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to that, because it's actually going to be kind of a little bit of a problem, and you can already sort of see why that's a problem, because unlike in the previous example, we now have borders around even the embedded tables or those nested tables. And so probably another thing worth doing is to come out here to your web browser and to go ahead and refresh it so that you get a better look at what your HTML page looks like. It's a little weird looking at this point. So continuing on with that, we'd like to add style to some of the other elements that we had previously styled. One that we had worked on before was the TH element. And with the TH element, we had also a border of a ridge. So we're going to start off with border ridge. And if I recall correctly, the last time we didn't actually specify the color in the TH tag. But now you'll see that each one of my column headings also has a border around it. And you might see it a little better in your web browser. Okay, so we're getting closer. We're a little bit closer. We still have the collapse tag. So it's collapsed the 2 borders. So now we have another option here. We can create a separate style for the TD tags, in which case then it's going to be border :ridge as well. And then this will put the border around each one of our cells. However, if you want to share some of the style between 2 elements, you can also simply separate the element names with a comma, and then this will also apply the same style to 2 different elements. So in this case, we could remove this unless you specifically wanted the cells in the body to differ from the cells in the head. Okay. Notice there's no changes in this particular example. Well, what about that nice looking gold head that we had, column header? And so if you were to come along and you were to specify the TR tag, and you were to specify the background color as gold, you actually inadvertently change the background color of all of the rows in the table, including all of the rows in the nested table. So that isn't quite what we had in mind. Well, your next possibility might be that you simply adjust the element name to the head, and that could accomplish this, except for the fact that we didn't include a head in those nested tables. Okay? So if we had included a head in those nested tables, then everything we had applied to the larger table would also be applied to those nested tables. So hopefully you're starting to see that identifying things solely by their element means that we may inadvertently apply our style too broadly. Another example of this would be the fact that we wanted to have different size columns or different width columns. And right now, if we apply that to the TH and TD tags, we would have a problem. So we have to investigate 2 other ways of going about assigning styles to elements of our HTML page. So the next way in which we can apply tags to our HTML elements, styles to our HTML elements, is by identifying the different elements using a global identifier known as an ID. And so if you come back to the W3 schools page, what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at the unique IDs that can be assigned to a specific element versus having a third option of a class of elements. So we're going to start with an ID, and what we hope to do is we hope to separate out the larger table from the smaller tables or those embedded tables, and then assign an ID to the larger table, and then assign a style specifically to that larger table. And so to begin with, what we want to do is we want to go back to our IDE, and under the main table or the larger table, what we want to do is we want to use the ID attribute, and we're just going to call this one main. So the table ID is going to be equal to main. Now what we will do is, instead of specifying the style based on the table element, what we're going to do instead is we're going to specify it based on that ID. So we switch out the element name, and we identify that we're using the tag by simply using the pound sign followed by the ID of the element. Now, the important thing to note here is that the ID must be unique on a given HTML page. So if we save this now, you'll see that we are one step closer. However, we still have not solved the issue of the border around the embedded cells. Okay, so we're going to continue working with this for just a second. All right, so continuing on here, what we want to do is we want to further differentiate between the cells in the main table and these smaller tables. Okay, so what we'll do is we're going to further differentiate between these two types of elements. Now, an ID will not work because the ID needs to be unique. At which point then you would wind up applying the same style sheets to, the same styles to multiple IDs separated by commas, which is fine for a limited number of elements, but becomes cumbersome when you start having a large number of rows or columns in your table. So we have to look for another way. So to do this, we are also going to use class names for our elements. And so once again, going back to the W3 schools page, you'll see that we can create IDs as well as classes and then style each. The big difference is that a class can be applied to multiple elements. So you can sort of think of it as a way to group elements. So to begin with, what I'd like to do is I would like to group or identify my TH, my heads, for my main table. And so in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it the name main underscore TH. Now, probably once again, not the name that you would use in a production environment, but the idea here is that I want us to identify that these are the column heads for the main table. All right, and so there are some rules when it comes to applying IDs and names. And if you take a look, just a second here, the ID attribute the ID attribute must be unique within the HTML page. The ID value is case sensitive, and it must contain at least one character and must not contain white spaces. So pretty typical naming conventions. Similar rules apply to the class as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to assign a class now to each one of these TH tags. And we are going to assign a different class now to the column headings in the embedded table. Okay. Now, in this particular case, we opted not to have a T head. If we had chosen to, we would need to address this, but instead, what we want to do now is we want to focus on the difference between the TD tags. And so we'll begin with creating a class now for our TD tags. And so this is going to be our main TD. And then I'm going to go one step further on this, and I'm actually going to identify each of the columns, because remember in our prior example, we actually specified a different width for each one of the columns. And by creating a different class for each one of the columns, we can actually group these. Specifically, if you recall, the first column was only 10 wide, while the second and fourth column, 10%, excuse me, while the second and fourth columns were 25%, and the third column was 40%. Okay, and so what we can do is we can just simply specify this is main TD1 and only assign this class to the first column. For the second column, we can assign class equal to main underscore TD2. And once again, since we kind of know that we want to style it such that the second and fourth columns take up 25%, while the third column takes up 40%, we can go ahead and apply that same class ID to the second and fourth columns. All right, so this is going to require a little bit of diligence on your part. Also notice I missed a quotation mark there when I copied and pasted, so occasionally that'll happen. So for our fourth column on row 2, and then also for our fourth column and our second column on row 3. And then lastly, we want to come along and we want to create a class for the third column. And so we're going to call that main underscore TD underscore 3. And this is only going to be applied to our third column. Now, the advantage of this is it means that any style that we apply to one of these columns or cells will not be applied to the cells in the nested table. And so basically what we're doing here is we are further delineating between the two. And so what we can do now is inside the embedded table, we'll start with the first one. In the TD tag, we're going to go ahead and give it a class name. And to contrast with the first one, we're going to call this one embedded TD. And we really didn't specify much of a difference between them. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just simply going to copy for all of the remaining TD tags, all of the nested TD tags, I'm just going to simply copy that class name. And so whatever we apply to one will apply to all of them. I think once you see the pattern here, you can make adjustments as necessary. So far, not a whole lot has changed because we're still using our element names, not our tag names. So let's see if we can't make a difference here. So, excuse me, we're using our tag names rather than the class names. So far we've used our main ID, but we're still applying the borders to the TH and TD tags. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and change this And so we want to think about what elements, what classes and what IDs do we want to apply our ridge to. And so if you recall correctly, we want to apply it to the head of our main table. So that was our main TH. And we specify that class name by simply using a period. So in this case, it's going to be main underscore TH. We also said that we want to apply that border to our individual cells in the table, but not in the main table, but not in the embedded table. So we've got a couple of different ways that we can go about doing it. We can apply this separately, or we can separate it by commas. And for this first example, we're going to go ahead and separate it, and we'll come back and do it, we'll optimize it later. And so in this case, it's going to be the main TD1, and we specify border ridge. And so now if we save this, we've applied the TH, excuse me, the border ridge to our main TH, and just to our first column in our main table. And to see this a little better, I encourage you to go back to your web browser and refresh it, and you'll see that I have a border around my first column, but not around my second, third, and fourth. So this is where we have to start thinking about now, how do we want to factor, how do we want to group these? Now our first column is unique because we also said that we want to specify the width. And the width was going to be, if you recall, was going to be 10%. We wanted that to be a little bit smaller. And so we can continue on with this by specifying the styles, not only for the first cell, the main TD1, but also subsequent cells, and the style that was applied to 2 will also get applied to the fourth column. So the second and the fourth column, we said we're both going to have a border using a ridge and the width of 25%. And then that leaves us just simply with main underscore TD3, which we said would also have a border ridge, but with the width of 40%. All right, so we save this real quick, and you'll see that this is starting to look more and more like what we had in our prior example. And if you notice, one of the big differences is now, particularly when you go back to your web browser and refresh it, is that all of our columns in our main table have borders, but the nested table columns there, or the column there, does not. Okay, so we've been able to separate out the two. Now, there were a few other minor little tweaks that we wanted to make. We said we wanted to adjust the text in our first column. So we go back to the main underscore TD1, and we want to adjust the text alignment. And in this case, what we want to do is we said that we'd like for it to be centered. The space after the colon doesn't really matter. That's a guess is perhaps if you're being picky. And now you see that we have centered the text. It's time probably now to bounce back to our table version 3 and notice that the only remaining thing that we really wanted to do was we wanted to make the table itself a little bit smaller. And in the prior example, we actually set it to 500 pixels. And so what you can do here is, since you have identified it using an ID, you can simply specify the width as 500 pixels. Now, before we do that, I want you to take just a second to think about the ramifications of what would happen if we were to use the table tag. And so that means that now that style would be applied to both tables, both sets of tables, not just the main table, but also the embedded table. So this is probably not a good use of the table tag from a style perspective. And instead, what you would want to do is you would want to specify the width, in this case of 500 pixels, inside the main, or the definition of the main ID. All right. So at this point, it would probably be useful for you to take a look at the prior example to see if there's any significant differences between the two. At least in cursory examination, it does not appear to be. If you refresh your web browser, you have now roughly the same page that we were looking at earlier. I hope you found this example useful. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to let me know. Thank you very much.